The air inside the velvet note was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted garlic, and the sharp tang of lemon polish used on the tables. It was a Friday night, which meant the chaos was at its peak. The low hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware against china plates, creating a constant wall of noise that wrapped around the room. For the young woman making her way through the tight maze of tables, the noise was just a backdrop to the rhythm of her work. Her feet ached. It was a dull, throbbing pain that started in her heels and shot all the way up her calves. She had been on the move for 6 hours straight, carrying heavy trays, navigating around tipsy patrons, and forcing a smile until her cheeks felt sore. Her uniform, a crisp black shirt and dark slacks, felt constricting, sticking to her skin slightly as she moved. She approached table 12, a large booth near the window occupied by a group celebrating a birthday. There were balloons tied to the chair and a half-eaten chocolate cake sitting in the middle of the table. "Can I get you folks anything else?" she asked, her voice polite but tired. She held a tray with 3 coffee cups balanced perfectly on her left hand. One of the men at the table, wearing a shiny suit and a loose tie, looked up at her. He waved his hand dismissively. "Just the check, sweetheart. We're done." "Of course," she said. She placed the coffees down gently, despite his rudeness, and pulled the leather folder from her apron pocket. She placed it on the table and turned away before the sigh could escape her lips. She walked back toward the service station, which was a small, cramped area behind the bar where the wait staff could catch their breath for a few seconds. She slid the check onto the counter for the bartender to process. As she waited, she leaned against the cool metal of the prep counter and closed her eyes for just a moment. It was quiet here, away from the guests. Just the sound of the dishwasher humming in the back and the ice clinking in the bar sink. Her mind drifted, as it often did when she was exhausted, to the reason she was working so hard. She thought about the small envelope she had stuffed into her purse before leaving her apartment that evening. It was a final notice for the electricity bill. The amount was more than she made in a week, and the due date was 2 days away. The stress of it sat like a rock in her stomach. She had calculated her tips 3 times in her head tonight, and she was still coming up short. "Order up!" the chef shouted from the kitchen window, snapping her back to reality. She pushed herself off the counter and grabbed the next tray. It held 4 steak dinners, the plates heavy and hot. She adjusted the weight on her shoulder, feeling the muscles in her neck tighten. This was her life now. A constant cycle of lifting, walking, smiling, and worrying. It wasn't that she hated the job, but it felt like she was wearing a mask. She was playing a role, the efficient, invisible server, while the rest of her was shrinking away. She navigated the dining room carefully, dodging a waiter rushing past with a bin of dirty glasses. She weaved through the crowd, murmuring "excuse me" and coming through as she moved. She delivered the steaks to a corner table, where a couple sat in silence. They didn't look at each other. They just looked at their phones. She placed the food down, told them to enjoy their meal, and left quickly. She hated seeing tables like that. It reminded her of how lonely the city could feel, even when you were surrounded by people. As she walked back toward the main floor, her path took her past the large stage area at the front of the room. It was raised up slightly, spotlighted by a warm, amber light. In the center of the stage sat the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a large grand piano with a glossy black finish that reflected the room's lights. It was closed right now, the lid down, looking more like a piece of furniture than an instrument. She slowed her steps as she passed it. She always did. For most of the customers in the lounge, the piano was just decoration, something to look at or to have their picture taken next to. But for her, it was a ghost. It was a memory of a life she used to have. She stopped for just a second, pretending to check the table next to the stage for napkins, but really she was just looking at the instrument. She remembered the way the keys felt cool, smooth, and responsive. She remembered the smell of the wood and the sound of the hammers striking the strings. She remembered sitting on a bench much smaller than this one, her feet dangling, while her father sat beside her, guiding her hands. Her father had been the one who taught her that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. He used to tell her that playing was about breathing. He said that the space between the notes was just as important as the notes themselves. He had sold his own car to buy her a keyboard when she was 8, just so she could practice every day. But that felt like a lifetime ago. She looked around the room to make sure no one was watching her. Seeing the coast was clear, she reached out her right hand. Her fingers, rough from handling trays and scrubbing tables, hovered over the closed lid. She didn't touch it, but she let her hand trace the shape of it in the air, mimicking the chord she used to play as a warm-up. It was a strange feeling, a mix of longing and guilt. She felt guilty because she hadn't played in over 2 years. After her father got sick, the music had stopped. The piano in their apartment had been sold to pay for medicine, and she had sold her keyboard to pay for the move to the city. She had promised herself she would find a way to play again, but life kept getting in the way. Rent, groceries, bills, there was always something more important than music. She pulled her hand back quickly as a group of customers walked past, laughing loudly. She straightened her uniform and picked up a water pitcher from a nearby side table. She needed to stop daydreaming. If the manager saw her standing around, she would get written up. She turned her back on the stage and headed toward the large round table in the center of the room. It was the biggest party of the night, a group of men in expensive suits who had been ordering expensive scotch all evening. They were loud, their laughter booming over the music, drawing attention from everyone in the room. As she walked closer, she could see the man at the head of the table. He was older, with a thick gold watch glinting on his wrist. He was telling a story, waving his hands around, commanding the attention of everyone seated with him. He looked like a man who was used to people listening to him. She tightened her grip on the water pitcher. She could feel the headache starting to bloom behind her eyes. She just wanted this shift to end. She wanted to go home, take off her shoes, and count her tips. But looking at the empty stage one last time over her shoulder, she felt a heavy pang in her chest. She missed the music. She missed who she was when she played. Taking a deep breath, she pasted on her customer service smile and approached the large table, unaware that the man at the head of the table had noticed her pause by the piano earlier. She stepped into the light of the chandelier, ready to refill their glasses, unaware that her night was about to shift from a boring grind into something that would remind everyone exactly who she was. The atmosphere at the large round table in the center of the room was different from the rest of the lounge. It was louder, sharper, and carried a certain energy that made the other diners glance over with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. The men sitting there were dressed in suits that probably cost more than the waitress made in a year. They were laughing loudly, the kind of laughter that fills a room and demands that everyone pay attention to them. At the head of the table sat the man who seemed to be the leader of the group. He was older, with silver hair that was perfectly styled, and he wore a suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically to fit his broad shoulders. He had a drink in his hand, something amber and expensive, and he was holding court, telling a story that had his friends hanging on his every word. "And I told them, you can't program soul into a machine," the man said, his voice booming slightly. "I bought the piano, yes. It's a beautiful instrument. But having it in my living room doesn't mean I know how to make it sing. That takes a gift. A gift I have, but frankly, most people don't." The men around the table chuckled, nodding in agreement. They were all successful men, used to being the smartest people in the room. They liked hearing that their success was due to gifts rather than just luck or hard work. The waitress approached the table carefully, holding a heavy glass water pitcher in both hands. She could feel the sweat on her palms making the glass slippery, so she gripped it tighter. She had learned that serving this specific type of customer required a delicate balance. You had to be invisible enough not to interrupt their flow, but present enough to ensure their glasses never went empty. It was a performance in itself. She reached the side of the man who was talking. He didn't look up at first. He was too busy gesturing with his drink, emphasizing a point about the difficulty of finding good help these days. "Water, sir?" she asked softly, trying to slide her hand in to place the pitcher near his glass without spilling a drop. The man stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly, looking at her with a slight smirk. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people wear when they think they know something you don't. "Ah, finally," he said, setting his glass down with a heavy clunk. "I was wondering where you had wandered off to. Probably daydreaming again." The comment caught her off guard, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the glass, pouring the water slowly. The ice cubes clinked gently against the sides. "I apologize for the delay, sir. It is a very busy night." "Busy," he repeated, testing the word as if it were a foreign concept. He leaned back in his chair, looking her up and down. His gaze lingered on her worn shoes and the slight fraying of her uniform cuff. "You know, I saw you earlier. Standing over there by the piano." She paused, the water stopping just an inch below the rim of the glass. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I was just checking the area, sir. Making sure it was clean." "Is that right?" The man laughed, a short, barking sound that made his friends turn to look at her. "You looked like you wanted to touch it. You looked like you were thinking you could actually play it." One of the other men at the table spoke up, a younger guy with a nervous laugh. "Come on, let the girl work. She doesn't want to hear your stories." "No, no, listen," the older man said, waving his hand to silence his friend. He didn't take his eyes off the waitress. It's fascinating. I see it all the time. People see a piano and they think, how hard can it be? They think it's like typing on a computer. But it's not. It takes years of discipline. It takes a certain level of class. The waitress felt her face get hot. She set the pitcher down on the table gently, though she wanted to slam it down. She knew what he was doing. He was flexing. He was showing off for his friends by making her feel small. It was a game rich people played sometimes, reminding service workers of their place. She forced her lips into the tight smile she had practiced 1,000 times. The piano is very nice, sir. It's a beautiful piece of furniture. Furniture, the man scoffed, shaking his head. See, that's exactly what I mean. To you, it's just a table with a lid. To me, it's a masterpiece. He took a sip of his water, swirling the liquid in the glass. I bet you've never even touched a real piano, have you? The table went quiet. The air seemed to thicken around them. The other waitstaff moved quickly in the background, trying not to look at what was happening. The waitress felt a knot form in her stomach. She wanted to walk away. She wanted to tell him that she had spent 10 years of her life practicing scales until her fingers bled. She wanted to tell him that she knew more about music than he ever would, but she couldn't. She needed the job. She needed the tip. She needed to pay the electricity bill. I have played a little, she said quietly, her voice steady but low. A little, the man mocked, mimicking her tone. He turned to his friends, his eyes wide with mock surprise. Did you hear that, gentlemen? She's played a little. He turned back to her, his smirk widening. Go on then. Prove it. Sir, she asked, confused. I need to get back to my other tables. Nonsense, he said, waving a hand dismissively. You aren't going anywhere. Not until you entertain us. I want to see you play. I can't just. It's simple, he interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, losing the playful edge and becoming colder. I spend a lot of money in this establishment. I bring a lot of friends here. And I am asking you to play a song for us. Just one. Let us see if your little bit of experience is worth anything. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, invading her personal space. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering. Go sit down. Play a simple C major scale. That's it? Just do re mi fa sol la ti I do. If you can do that without messing up, I'll give you $100 tip right now. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. He was daring her. He was setting her up to fail, convinced that a tired waitress in a cheap uniform would crumble under the pressure. He wanted to be able to laugh about it later, telling the story of the time he tried to let the help play the piano and how terrible it sounded. She looked at the $100 bill he pulled out of his pocket and slapped onto the table. It sat there, crisp and green, next to his dirty plate. It was a bribe. It was an insult. But as she looked at that bill, she didn't see money. She saw the past due notice. She saw the empty refrigerator at home. She saw the tired, worn-out version of herself in the mirror every morning. She saw the years of silence since she last played. She felt a sudden spark of anger deep in her chest. It wasn't a hot, blinding rage, but a cold, hard resolve. She remembered what her father used to say when she was nervous before a recital. They don't know you. They don't know what's inside you. You play for yourself, not for them. She looked at the man's arrogant face. He thought he knew her. He thought he had her figured out. He thought she was just a background character in his movie. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. She adjusted the strap of her apron. "Okay," she said, her voice clearer than before. The man raised an eyebrow, surprised. He hadn't expected her to agree. He thought she would make an excuse and run away. "Okay, really, you're brave? Or stupid? We'll see which one." "I will play," she said, ignoring his jab. "But I won't play a scale. If I am going to play, I am going to play a song." The table erupted in whispers. The friends looked at each other, grinning. This was better than they expected. This was going to be a disaster, and they had front row seats. The man laughed, delighted. "A song. Bold. I like it." He gestured toward the stage with a grand sweep of his arm, like a king granting a favor to a peasant. "Be my guest. The stage is yours. Don't disappoint us." She turned away from the table without saying another word. She walked through the restaurant, her steps firm. The noise of the room seemed to fade away as she focused on the instrument sitting alone in the spotlight. She could feel every eye in the room following her. The pressure was immense, like a physical weight pushing down on her shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel tired. She felt awake. The walk from the center table to the small stage felt like the longest journey of her life. It was only maybe 20 feet, but with every step, she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders. The usual clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation were fading away, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. People sensed that something was happening. The energy in the room shifted from casual dining to a sudden, sharp focus. She was the subject of that focus, and it made her skin prickle with a mixture of heat and cold. As she moved, her mind was racing. She was stepping far outside the boundaries of her role. Waitresses did not touch the instruments. They served the people who touched the instruments. She was terrified of the consequences. Would the manager come running out of the back office to stop her? Would he fire her on the spot for causing a scene? She thought about the electricity bill sitting on her kitchen counter, the red final notice stamped on the front. Losing this job would be a disaster. It would mean giving up her apartment, moving back in with relatives, admitting defeat. The risk was enormous, but the arrogant man's voice echoed in her ears, mocking her. It was the sting of his smirk, the assumption that she was empty inside, that pushed her forward. She realized she would rather lose her job than keep her dignity locked away in a closet. She reached the raised platform and stepped up onto the wood flooring. The spotlight hit her, brighter and harsher than it looked from the floor. It blinded her for a moment, hiding the faces of the crowd and leaving her alone in a pool of amber light. All she could see was the piano. Up close, it was even more magnificent than it was from a distance. The black finish was mirror-like, reflecting her own tired image back at her, a woman in a wrinkled uniform, hair slightly frizzy from the humidity of the kitchen, eyes wide with nerves. She walked around to the bench. It was a long, leather seat, polished to a shine. She stood there for a moment, her hands hanging by her sides. They were trembling slightly. She looked at her palms, red and rough from carrying hot trays and scrubbing tables all day. These were not the hands of a concert pianist. They were worker's hands. For a second, a wave of insecurity crashed over her. Who was she kidding? She hadn't played seriously in years. Her fingers were stiff. She was out of practice. She was about to humiliate herself in front of a room full of strangers. She glanced over her shoulder toward the table where the man in the expensive suit was sitting. He had turned his chair around to face the stage. He was leaning back, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of amused anticipation on his face. He was expecting a train wreck. He was waiting for her to fumble, to hit a wrong note, to prove him right that talent was reserved for people like him. Beside him, his friends were checking their watches or smirking at one another. They had already written her off. The sight of his arrogance acted like a spark in a dry forest. Her fear didn't disappear, but it suddenly had a competitor: anger. A quiet, steely resolve formed in her chest. She remembered the countless hours she had spent as a child in a small, drafty apartment, practicing on an old keyboard while her father cooked dinner in the next room. She remembered the way music used to make her feel like she could fly. That girl was still in there. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a bill payer. She was a musician, even if she hadn't touched the keys in 2 years. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool air of the lounge, and let it out slowly. She sat down on the bench. The leather creaked softly under her weight. It felt familiar. It felt like coming home after a very long trip. She adjusted her position, scooting forward until she was the right distance from the keys. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keyboard, letting her fingers find their natural curve. The silence in the room was absolute now. Even the kitchen staff had paused to look out through the service doors. The air conditioning seemed to hum louder than usual. It was the kind of silence that is heavy, the kind that waits for a single sound to break it. Her right hand shook just a little as she lowered it toward the keys. She intended to play the simple scale the man had mocked her with, just to get her fingers used to the feel of the action. She wanted to test the instrument, to feel the resistance of the keys. Her index finger touched the cool ivory of middle C. But the moment her finger made contact, something happened. It was like a switch flipped in her brain. The connection between her hand and the instrument was instant, electric. The key responded with a perfect, weighted resistance, and the sound that rang out was clear and resonant. It wasn't just a note, it was a voice. Instead of playing the scale, her hand moved on its own. Muscle memory, dormant for so long, suddenly roared to life. Her fingers struck a chord, a minor chord, full and melancholy. It hung in the air, vibrating through the floorboards and up into her spine. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised by her own actions, but then her left hand joined in. She began to play. She didn't know what song it was officially, it wasn't a famous classical piece or a popular jazz standard. It was a melody she had heard in her head for years, a mix of the sadness she felt about her father and the frustration she felt about her life. It was a song she had never written down, a song that lived only in her fingers. At first, her playing was slow, cautious. She was testing the waters, feeling out the dynamics of the piano. But as the melody flowed, she gained confidence. The stiffness in her joints began to melt away, replaced by a fluid motion she thought she had lost forever. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She wasn't thinking about the technique. She was just feeling. She was pouring her exhaustion, her fear, her gratitude for the job she had, and her longing for the life she wanted, all into the music. The notes were complex, weaving together in patterns that cascaded down the keyboard like rain. It wasn't background noise anymore. It was a story. It was a conversation. She heard a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the man's table, but she didn't look. She closed her eyes, blocking out the spotlight, blocking out the room, and let herself disappear into the sound. She wasn't a waitress in a cheap uniform anymore. She was an artist again. The rhythm of the night shifted. The grinding fatigue of the last 8 hours was being transmuted into something beautiful, something alive. She wasn't just hitting keys, she was breathing. The moment her fingers fully committed to the melody, the air in the room shifted instantly. It was as if a vacuum had formed, sucking out all the chaotic noise of clinking glasses, scraping chairs, and idle chatter. The only thing that existed was the sound pouring out of the instrument. It started low and rumbling, a deep, bluesy rhythm that seemed to rise from the floorboards, but it quickly climbed, spinning into a complex, lightning-fast run of notes that filled every corner of the lounge. She wasn't reading music. There was no sheet music on the stand, and she hadn't looked at a note on a page in years. She was playing from a place that had been dormant for a long time, a deep reservoir of memory and emotion. Her hands, which had been stiff and clumsy just moments before, were now flying across the keys with a speed and precision that was shocking to watch. Her right hand danced on the higher notes, playing a melody that was both heartbreaking and hopeful, while her left hand grounded the song with a powerful, driving bass line. The tension in her shoulders, the knot that had been there since she clocked in, began to unravel. She closed her eyes, letting her head tilt slightly to the side. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worrying about the rent. She wasn't thinking about the rude customer or the heavy trays. She was remembering the feeling of sitting on her father's lap, his hands guiding hers, teaching her that music was the only language where you could say everything without speaking a single word. She poured that longing into the music, letting the notes ring out with a raw intensity that made the instrument hum and vibrate against her body. The group of men at the center table had gone completely silent. The man in the expensive suit, who had been smirking with such confidence just minutes before, was now frozen. His arms were still crossed, but the smug expression had been wiped clean off his face, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. He looked at the woman on the stage, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a waitress. He saw a force of nature. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had challenged a master, thinking she was a novice, and now he was the one who looked small. His friends were equally stunned. One of them had been halfway through lifting a drink to his lips when the music started, and now he was stuck there, hovering, forgetting to take a sip. They looked at each other with wide eyes, unable to process the fact that the woman they had been ignoring and mocking was creating the most beautiful sound any of them had heard in a very long time. It was technically flawless scales and arpeggios that most professional musicians would struggle to play cleanly, executed with an effortless grace. The music wasn't just fast, it was emotional. It swelled and dipped like a living thing. It was fierce and angry one moment, then soft and gentle the next, mimicking the erratic beat of a stressed human heart. She played a series of chords that were so rich and full they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. She was improvising, making it up as she went along, reacting to the acoustics of the room, taking the energy of the audience and throwing it back at them amplified. Other patrons in the restaurant had stopped eating entirely. A couple near the window held hands across the table, listening with tears in their eyes. The bartender, who had been drying a glass with a towel, stopped moving entirely, the cloth forgotten in his hand. Even the kitchen staff had lined up in the small window of the swing doors, their faces pressed against the glass, watching in awe. The woman, who was usually just a blur in the background, someone who refilled their water and took their dirty plates, was commanding the room. She owned the floor. She transitioned into a section of the song that was incredibly intricate, a flurry of notes that required her hands to cross over each other rapidly. Her posture had changed. She wasn't hunched over like a tired worker anymore, she was sitting tall, her back straight, her movements fluid and assured. The music was taking her somewhere else, and she was taking everyone along for the ride. The man at the big table uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes glued to her hands. He was trying to find a mistake, a slip, a moment where she faltered, but it never came. She played like she had been born on that bench. It was the kind of talent that cannot be taught, the kind of raw, natural ability that separates the good from the great. He suddenly felt very foolish. Here he was, a man who had bought a piano just to look at, trying to humble a woman who carried the music in her blood. He saw the truth in that moment. He had money, yes, but she had something money couldn't buy. She had soul. The song began to reach its climax. The notes grew faster, the rhythm more intense. She was playing with a ferocity that made the instrument rock slightly on its wheels. She was hitting the keys hard, but not carelessly. Every strike was precise, every note intentional. It was a storm of sound, a chaotic mix of jazz and classical influences that shouldn't have worked together but did perfectly. The sound swelled to a crescendo, filling the large room, vibrating in the chests of everyone listening. Then, without warning, she stopped. She didn't fade out slowly. She didn't drag out the ending. She struck a final, resonant chord that seemed to slice through the air like a knife. She held her hands on the keys, letting the sound ring out, echoing off the walls, the vibration slowly decaying into a heavy, absolute silence. She pulled her hands back into her lap and opened her eyes. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavier now than it was before she started playing. It was a reverent silence, the kind that follows a truly great performance when the audience is too stunned to react immediately. The air in the room felt charged, electric, as if the ghost of the music was still floating around them. The woman on the bench blinked, the spell breaking as the reality of her surroundings rushed back in. The bright spotlight felt hot again. Her hands, which had been flying so fast a moment ago, were now resting quietly on her legs. She looked down at them, surprised by what they had just done. It felt like a dream. For 3 minutes, she hadn't been a struggling waitress, she had been free. But now, as the adrenaline began to fade, she remembered where she was. She remembered who she was supposed to be. And a wave of panic started to rise in her chest. As the final vibration of the chord faded into the heavy silence of the room, the young woman felt a rush of cold reality replace the warm fire of her performance. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might be visible through her shirt. She blinked rapidly, the spotlight blinding her, and for a terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. Then, the smell of roasted garlic and stale wine reached her nose again. She was in the velvet note. She was a waitress in a wrinkled uniform. And she had just stopped working to give a private concert to the most difficult table in the house. Panic, sharp and hot, flared in her chest. What had she just done? She had abandoned her section. She had walked away from her duties to play a song on the company's expensive instrument. She could feel the imaginary pink slip being printed in the manager's office right now. Her hands, still tingling from the movement of the keys, began to shake again, but this time from fear instead of nerves. She couldn't look at the crowd. She couldn't look at the man who had challenged her. She just wanted to disappear. She stood up quickly, the legs of the bench scraping against the floor with a screech that seemed deafening in the quiet room. She smoothed the front of her apron, a nervous habit, and forced her head down. She needed to get back to the safety of the kitchen. She needed to grab her things and leave before the manager came out and started yelling. She turned away from the piano, her eyes fixed on the floor, preparing to make the walk of shame back to the service station. She had taken only 2 steps when the sound started. It wasn't the polite, slow applause you give when someone drops a tray and you want to make them feel better. It wasn't the bored clapping of people waiting for their food. It started with one person near the bar, a sharp, loud clap. Then, another joined in from the back. Within seconds, the room exploded. It was a roar, a wave of genuine, enthusiastic noise that hit her back like a physical force. People were standing up. The couple near the window was clapping with their hands held high. The bartender was slamming his towel on the counter in rhythm. She froze for a moment, stunned. She had expected laughter, or perhaps silence, but not this. The energy of the room had completely flipped. No one was looking at her as the tired server anymore. They were looking at her with respect, with admiration, with a sense that they had just witnessed something special. But she couldn't process it. The fear of losing her job was too strong. She didn't bow. She didn't smile and wave. She just quickened her pace, practically power walking toward the kitchen, dodging customers who were reaching out to pat her on the shoulder or offer a high five. She felt like she was escaping a fire, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. As she passed the large round table in the center, she saw the man in the expensive suit out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't clapping. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded in front of him, staring at the empty piano bench. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked smaller. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps, a man who had just been humbled by the truth. He didn't look up at her as she rushed past, and she was grateful. She didn't want to see his pity or his anger. She reached the swing doors of the kitchen and pushed through them, letting the heavy rubber flaps slap shut behind her, cutting off the noise of the applause. The kitchen was chaotic as usual, chefs shouting, pans clanging, the smell of steam and spices. It was a stark contrast to the stillness of the dining room. She leaned against the stainless steel counter near the sink, burying her face in her hands for a moment. She waited for the shouting to start. She waited for the manager to storm in and demand her apron. "Hey!" She jumped and looked up. It was the floor manager, a usually stressed-out man who was constantly checking his watch. He was standing in the doorway, looking out at the floor. He turned to look at her, his face pale and his eyes wide. Did you do that?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. She nodded slowly, terrified. "I'm sorry. He asked me to play, and I just... I'm sorry. I'll get back to work. Please don't fire me." The manager stared at her for a long moment. Then, he looked back out at the dining room, where the applause was finally starting to die down, replaced by a loud, excited buzz of conversation. He looked at the empty tables that were now full of energy, the guests who looked more alive than they had all week. "Fire you?" he said, a strange, confused smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "I don't know what you did out there, but Table 7 has been asking for the check for 20 minutes. Now they're ordering dessert. And look at the tip line." He held up a receipt he had grabbed from a waiter's station. She squinted at it. The tip line was a blur of zeros. "I think you just saved the night," the manager said, shaking his head slowly. "Just, go take a breath. Wash your face. And when you go back out, try not to look like you're about to pass out." She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. Her knees felt weak, but for the first time, it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from relief. She walked over to the sink and turned on the cold water, splashing some on her face. The cool liquid shocked her skin, waking her up. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the prep station. Her face was flushed, her eyes were bright, and she looked different. The tiredness was still there, etched in the lines around her eyes, but the dullness was gone. Something was alive behind her eyes again. She dried her hands with a rough paper towel and took a deep breath. She wasn't a prodigy. She wasn't a famous concert pianist. She was still a woman with a stack of bills and a long shift ahead of her. But she knew something now that she had forgotten. She knew that the world couldn't take everything from her. As long as she had her hands, and as long as she had her memories, she still had something valuable inside. She pushed open the kitchen doors and stepped back onto the floor. The atmosphere was lighter. The noise was happy now. As she walked past the tables, people stopped her. Not to complain about the water or ask for more napkins, but to thank her. A woman dining alone reached out and squeezed her hand as she passed, her eyes shining with tears. "That was beautiful," the woman whispered. "Thank you for sharing that." The young woman smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're very welcome," she said softly. She walked past the piano. It sat there, glossy and imposing. She didn't stop this time. She didn't need to touch it to know it was there. She knew the music was in her, not the wood and wires. She walked toward the back of the room to clear a table. She picked up a heavy tray of dirty dishes, balancing it on her shoulder. It felt lighter than it had an hour ago. Her feet still hurt, and the rent was still due, but the weight on her soul was gone. She walked a little taller, moving through the room with a quiet confidence. She had played like a prodigy, yes, but she was leaving as herself, a survivor, a worker, and a musician, finally ready to face the music of her own life.